excited to announce our keynote address from Jennifer Sheehy-Skeffington, who's an associate professor of social psychology at the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics. Dr. Sheehy-Skeffington is a social psychologist who's interested in the mechanisms underlying our human sensitivity to power, status, and group membership. Her research has two strands, and that work sort of tries to articulate the mutual influence of psychological and societal processes. So the first applies a lens of social dominance theory to explore the psychological foundations and downstream consequences of socio-political attitudes, such as egalitarianism. And the second strand really draws on socio-ecological psychology to investigate the impact of socioeconomic strain on basic decision-making processes. So we're excited to hear from Dr. Sheehy-Skeffington today. Let's turn it over to her for our keynote address.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here. The time zones have prevented me from joining this gathering before, but I've heard great things about it, and I'm just very grateful to SIGA for the support to be able to come over here and speak with you all and hear from you all, which is the bit I'm really excited about. But I've got to earn it, so right. Socio-ecological psychology. I just thought in thinking about psychology meets economics, what kind of big picture perspectives might it be helpful to think about? And what psychology has typically been very useful for, and maybe is most known for in popular discourse, is this idea of how can we have the right mindset to deal with adversity, challenges in life. Perhaps one thing we've learned is that you need to stay focused, and in particular, the importance of executive functioning in terms of academic achievement and other various beneficial decision-making, to keep your eyes on the prize, to focus on long-term as opposed to short-term rewards, to look on the bright side, maintain positive affect, have a positive attitude, and to lean on others, especially studied in the area of social trust, and then importantly to believe in yourself, believe that you can do it, and that this will make a difference. Now, it's one thing to present them when that's the kind of peak that you're facing. When the mountain looks a little bit different, which is that when you're going to a food bank on a regular basis, as fortunately many more and more people in the UK and the US are, and I'm sure in many other countries these days, these mindsets don't translate so easily. It's harder to bring them about, and one comes to wonder how useful they are. In particular, but that hasn't stopped us in our first wave of kind of thinking about, okay, how can we understand how useful these might be to understanding what has been described as, let's say, the behavioral dimension of poverty. Anything from the socioeconomic gradient in unhealthy behaviors, such as smoking, eating unhealthy food, drinking excessive alcohol, being less likely to exercise. All of these are the lower in income you are, less likely to have bank accounts, more likely to take out high interest loans, and less likely to invest in education and to perform well in educational tasks. Now, before psychologists or behavioral scientists should even come in, we need to, of course, recognize the role of structural constraints in almost all of these. If you have terrible school facilities or teachers who don't show up, if you are constantly discriminated against through banking and don't have access to mainstream sources of financial support, if you don't live in a walkable neighborhood, if you're constantly prey to predatory advertising and predatory fast food outlets, then it's almost impossible to make the right kind of decisions. But the reason this is an area of growth is because even taking all of those into account, right? Even taking into account opportunities and environmental constraints, there still seem to be choices and decisions that people are making that are described as a problem, and that we do have sometimes evidence can enhance their situation in poverty. I think smoking is a classic example because it's kind of like, well, actually this costs money. If you're so short on money, why is it you're spending your money on smoking cigarettes? It seems to be this classic space where the discourse around decision-making in poverty is most acute. And what excites me when I did my PhD was that it seemed that sociology had stopped talking about the behavioral dimension of poverty because of its stigmatizing potential. And that when I first saw Eldar Shafir, I think, come and give a talk and look at how experiments can demonstrate a different approach to thinking about behavior and poverty, I was like, wait a second, if we don't talk about this, we're just leaving open a vacuum for everyone else to make assumptions about why people make the decisions they do. Maybe we can bring a more systematic empirical approach to this. So the one I've tried to explore is broadly trying to think about decisions and behaviors in the context of the situations of poverty that people are in, and specifically trying to understand those situations as a socio-ecology. Partly I draw from behavioral ecology, which is actually a field of study that is most commonly done in non-humans, but from which we've learned a lot of really important principles around how it is that agents faced with scarcity and unpredictability react in particular environments, learn from those environments. But also it's socioecology because I'm a social psychologist. These environments are not just about material resources. It's also about how much you have relative to others, how much you are treated, how well you are treated by others, your sense of inclusion in wider society. And the first part of my talk, I'll just be kind of presenting, little snippets of evidence for this general claim that material and social adversity shape decision-making processes, these kinds of, I think about it in terms of both material and social resources, and I think we have enough evidence now to know that scarcity in resources is not the only thing, also unpredictability. But the most important thing is to think about, I think, what is the socio-ecological cue that is salient when people come to make a decision. But I don't need to spend too long on that because I think you're all already convinced of that. So what I thought I'd do today is let's have a little trot through these 5 different mindsets that are being recommended to people and ways to behave and to enable flourishing in the face of adversity, and think about how they themselves might be affected by, constrained, or maybe modulated, right? Not necessarily damaged, modulated, shifted in response to adversity. And then I want to hopefully have some time to take a step back and just think about where do these mindsets come from, actually? Where do we get the idea that there is a particular way of behaving one should aspire towards? And then are there, from that point, what happens if we think beyond them? Are there kind of different ways of relating that are foreclosed by focusing on such mindsets, and what might the impact of those be? Okay, so that means in order to get there, it means that I do need to not dwell and sadly not be as considered and open in presenting all of this research. I'm just going to show you snapshots of results slides. So what about executive functioning? I mean, obviously there are seminal papers here that I don't need to tell you about that early demonstrated that the experience of poverty, financial strain can actually disrupt, constrain basic cognitive functioning. One way in which I look at this is, as I mentioned, through an ecological approach to think, well, is it the case that the brain would kind of shut down or not be able to perform as well in response to socioeconomic strain? Or might there be some way to figure out, where are the resources going? Where is the attention going? One way I looked at this as part of a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship, which I only did 1 year of, so I got this data and I still haven't written it up. This is with Michael Price, Isabel Scott, and Nick Pound, is that we looked at hunger, right? We looked at one particular kind of resource in which we're scarce, because I do think that the specific kind of resource you're scarce in matters. And we had people fasting for 12 hours. We randomly assigned people to have breakfast or not have breakfast, and then administered cognitive measures. Now, there's generally the finding that if you're fasting for this length of time, you perform worse on cognitive tasks. But the question is, where have your cognitive resources gone then? Are they just kind of, oh no, I'm totally depleted because I've got low glucose? Or if we present cognitive tasks in ways that might be relevant to meeting the resource in which you're scarce, might we see things a little bit differently? So we did this in 2 different ways. One was a short-term memory task. I chose these tasks because they had the most reliable effects in terms of cognitive disruption in the face of food scarcity. And there's then on top of this, between subject variation in hunger versus satiation, there's a within subjects variation of the stimuli in the task, right? So some of the words in the short-term memory task involve food. Some of them are matched for length and frequency, emotion words, and matched and neutral. In the visual search task, what we did is we have here, this version of the visual search task is find the kebab. We have another, it doesn't work so well now after lunch, but you'd be really fast if it was before lunch. And then what we have is we have identical array where what you've got to find is a clothing item, and that clothing item is matched for visual complexity and a range of other factors. We had multiple arrays. They did 64 trials of this at different array sizes. Right, so what do we find? I mean, and we did not color code the words like this. This is for clarity, and the words were randomly ordered. And we find when it comes to non-food items, in terms of short-term memory performance, yes, there is worse performance among those experiencing food scarcity. But this is not the case when it comes to the food items. Here it's just standardized scores across the two different food, non-food item types. And you can see it looks like it's better performance among the hungry group. That isn't significant, but certainly there's that interaction there where the type of stimulus matters when it comes to deciding is short-term memory affected by food scarcity. The visual search task, it's slightly less clear. I mean, the main finding is, well, first of all, people are always faster at finding food items than clothing items. But there is this kind of facilitation advantage that hungry people seem to have, especially in the 16 item array. So we only find this in the small, this is a 16 item, actually no, it's not a 16 item array, sorry, I haven't put up the right example. Overall, it emerges only marginally, but it's there and that's it. So one thing I want to do once I stop moving around, because I'm always moving around, is to sit down and try to replicate this just with 16 item arrays. If anyone's interested in working with me on this, let me know. Not just material adversity, also social adversity. The first way I started looking at this was during my PhD. So this was Jim Sedenius, who's my PhD advisor. And also the later work with Michael Kraus is we said, well, it's not just about, you know, what do you have, okay? It's also about what do you think you have in relation to others? And that's helpful in a way if you're a social psychologist, because then what you can do is you can mess with people's construal of what they have in relation to others. And it turns out people don't have a good perception of where they sit socioeconomically compared to others in society or compared to others in their university. I've varied this a number of different ways. Here is, since we're focused on executive functioning, we found this in 3 separate studies, reduced executive functioning performance if you're given false feedback that you were lower in SES than others in the United States. This is after my collecting a lot of information about your income and occupation, etc., from you, and we do various tests for credibility. Found this on 3 different tasks, and also then on a financial decision-making task that I designed specifically to draw on these executive functions. So if you thought that you were doing worse than others in society socioeconomically, you were less likely to identify the best of 3 credit card offers. So that's that. But similar to the previous task, what's happening here, oh, I got poor SES, you know, I'm just going to have a cognitive shutdown. Or maybe you've just told me I'm worse than others in SES. Why are you asking me to do this executive functioning task? I've got other things to worry about. I'm not saying we're consciously reflecting on this, but I do think that we have unconscious modulatory mechanisms that are redirecting limited cognitive resources to what's most adaptive in the moment. So what's most adaptive in the moment here is going to be something that helps you gain SES. So the additional variation that we explored, this was with Michael in my postdoc, was what if we present the executive functioning tasks as either relevant to the domain that's under threat, and we just give them a paragraph talking about how executive functioning is linked to later life gains in SES, like a paragraph with true research showing the importance of executive functioning to SES, versus the other group getting a paragraph just talking about executive functioning linked to brain function, you know, with the same number of references, all true. There, we find this time it's in the UK, so the initial effect is a lot smaller. You can see it's only marginal, but in the low relevance condition, almost worse performance on the 2-back task here if you've got the poor SES feedback, but the shifting the relevance of the task seems to make that effect go away. We replicated this then in a measure that I think is more tightly tied to this idea of motivation and of channeling your cognitive resources, a concentration task, the D2 test of attention, and we see it again. So in both of these studies, it's a similar pattern, which is that in experiencing scarcity or a threat, either in terms of social or material resources, are leading to this like modulation of your cognitive resources to focus on the domain under threat. That's just cognition, there are 4 more. Okay, what about self-regulation? I mean, there's some great work here. You'll all know the marshmallow task, and you'll know the study by Kid Palmieri and others showing that, you know, when you vary the reliability of the environment, suddenly what's rational for children to do in terms of whether they wait for the second marshmallow shifts. And you find that when the experimenter is unreliable, nobody waits for the second marshmallow. When the experimenter is clearly reliable, almost everybody waits, right? Ruggieri et al. Also looking at things like temporal discounting and finding a gradient with SES, right? So we know that those lower in SES seem to be worse at self-regulation, engaging greater discounting of the future, and yet it may be something to do with the cues one is getting from one's environments. So I haven't done I haven't done experimental work looking at self-regulation, except for what I'll show you at the end. But Julia Buzan, my graduating PhD student, has looked at one of the best data sets out there for looking at material adversity, the Understanding Society longitudinal study in the UK. And here we focused on smoking as a kind of a behavioral manifestation of present orientation. And she finds this is cross-sectionally that if you ask people to report their subjective financial situation, the more difficult they say it is, the more likely they are to smoke, and also the more cigarettes per day they smoke. These are actually quite large effects. And that these effects are mediated by subjective financial situation. Now, it's one thing to show that cross-sectionally, we can also show it longitudinally. The thing is, there isn't that much variation in these measures over time, but we did do one random intercept cross-leg panel model, and it implies that what's happening here is that financial adversity is predicting the number of cigarettes as opposed to the reverse. The issue here is that to have enough people who are already smokers and in all the waves, our sample size goes way down, right? You saw what it was before. This is only 96 people here. So, right. So that's self-regulation. Positive affect. Ivan, we know that positive affect really matters. We know that subjective well-being, self-reported at least, is lower among those low in income. Am I talking too fast, by the way? How's my speed? Okay, I get really excited, sorry. Ivan Cano, another graduating PhD student of mine, he came to me and he said, you know, your model is great, but you don't have affect, you don't have emotion. You need to look at the emotional dimension of poverty. And he's in particular focused on socioeconomic shame. One way in which he looks at it is especially looking at the relationship between subjective reported socioeconomic status on the MacArthur ladder and your sense of shame for your socioeconomic position. And here he's looking at it mediated through possible selves, like distance from the ought self, the ideal self, the feared self. And we'll have Hazel Marcus joining us later, from whom the theoretical underpinning of this comes. So Ivan did here a longitudinal study over 2 years, so he's kind of has a number of cross-line models looking at what a socioeconomic shame is predicted by, and also what factors might mitigate it, and what this relationship is moderated by. That's affect. Okay, social trust. It's always good to lean on others. You need to be able to engage with others and to realize the positive sum nature of those interactions. I think an influential paper here is Jon Jakimowicz's one, looking at how community support can moderate the relationship between poverty and myopia or present orientation. So there he finds that it's in particular, so usually poorer people are more myopic, but those who report having higher levels of social support, or those who receive an intervention that enhances community support or community efficacy, let's say, don't report that relationship. The reason I'm saying community support efficacy is because I think there's a few different things going on in that paper, and I think this highlights this idea of what do we mean by social support. I'm going to come back to that later. Here, the way Ivan looked at this with the World Values Survey is there's this nice, my general approach to the idea of trust is that there's in general conflicting findings over the link between SES and social prosociality in general. Some evidence from Paul Pitt, for example, that people are more generous the lower they are in SES, but there's also evidence of greater antisocial behavior and aggressivity among those lower in SES and lower general social trust. I think part of the reason why we have contradictory findings is that we're not looking at who are people trusting, right? Because there might be very good reasons why you would not trust society, institutions, why you would act out in institutional settings if you're socioeconomically marginalized. But to the extent that you're more interdependent on those close to you, and that's the space where you'd see greater trust. So one way of looking at this is a construct that Delhay et al. Proposed using the World Values Survey items. They actually measure social trust in general, but also in specifically your family, your friends, and people you know well. And then also people of another religion, people of another country, and people you meet for the first time. So they call the first 3 in-group trust, the last 3 out-group trust. And what they do here is they compute the regression coefficient for general social trust on each of those. And what that means is that when you ask people about general social trust, are they reporting about something that's closest to in-group trust to people close to them, versus out-group trust? And so Ivan took that measure, and you can only do this at the national level because it's a regression coefficient. And he finds, controlling for a number of other things, richer countries have a higher radius of trust, implying that there is this kind of narrowness of focus among those lower in income. It's hard to interpret too much on the cross-country level, At the individual level, what you can do is you can compute in-group trust bias. So if this social proximity hypothesis is correct, then we should find that the lower in income you are, the more biased you are towards trusting in-group members versus out-group members. And that's what we find too. Okay, so this is the 4 of these, and when considering these kind of environments of socioeconomic strain, it gets a bit more complicated. That's meant to be kind of grayed out to both to be able to assume that people can readily marshal these mindsets and maybe even to think about whether they might be adaptive or useful. I don't know where the L went. Why is that? I mean, the last of these I mentioned was believe in yourself, right? Personal control. And I think that kind of occupies a different space because your perception of how much control you have is a little bit more upstream. I think that's part of your read of your socioecology in the first place. And that's what might explain some other downstream effects. We need to figure out what are the ecological conditions people are exposed to? How do they read those? I think social trust is probably a read as well of your socioecology. And then what does that mean for further things? So now I'm just going to think about personal control, perceived control. I mean, in psychology, an old paper that inspired me, and this is Lachman and Weaver, that uses these psychological measures of perceived control. Now, here's my big thing, is that Ellen Skinner made this point back in 1996, but I think it's really important, that perceived control really does have 2 components. The first is thinking about, can you do the actions you want to do, right? And that's what most of us tend to be measuring. That's self-efficacy. If I made a plan, I would be certain I can make it work versus I feel that there's nothing I could do well. But there's another side of it, which is outcome expectations, right? Or what I would call response efficacy. So there's one thing about, are you efficacious in doing the actions? Response efficacy is the extent to which you feel like your actions actually have an impact on life outcomes. This is, it's hard to find good measures for this. I think locus of control is closer to this because it's this idea of how much do things that work out and depend on what you do. And the Pearland and Schooner measure of personal mastery and perceived constraints, I use the perceived constraints side of it. What happens to me in the future mostly depends on me. I have little control over the things that happen to me. And the reason this matters is because, I mean, as I can see from some of your nods, maybe you can see how response efficacy is going to be very tightly connected to socioeconomic conditions, right? There are certain conditions where it doesn't matter what you do, you have low power, you're not able to affect a change in your life circumstances. And no level of self-efficacy intervention is going to improve that. In fact, there's evidence that if you believe you have greater control over your environment than you do, it could be detrimental. If you increase people's sense that they can do stuff and doing stuff doesn't make a difference, that's not going to get us anywhere. This isn't to say that these sense of agency doesn't matter. I think it's to say that we need to think about giving people actual power, lifting actual constraints, and then being sure that they're aware of it, right? And then being sure that actually there is a change now in the outcome contingency, because sometimes people do have more power than they realize. And so there's always that scope for the psychological intervention. So I first looked at this. Anytime you see Jim, it's always old PhD work. I designed this household budgeting game where you play and you try to balance a household budget. You're either in a rich condition or a poor condition. You choose these different spending. And you kind of make all these decisions and lots of things are controlled. But it's quite an extreme intervention in terms of like, when you're in the rich condition here, you've loads of money at the end of the month. When you're in the poor condition, you don't. And you play this for 3 months. And then after playing it, people report big differences in sense of power, but in particular, differences in perceived control over life outcomes. And that is kind of surprising because it is meant to be, perceived control over life outcomes is meant to be a trait measure. But sense of control goes down when you're in the low SES condition here. And that affects something like health efficacy, the extent to which you think you're likely to behave in healthy ways. What about social adversity? So again, this like ladder prime, here's another version of it where I think others have used this too, where you give people an income scale where they're either going to be completing, you know, it's kind of rigged so that most people have to go into the bottom section of it versus the top section of it in the high income prime. Here again, we find these effects on sense of control. This is an example of a study where it's not just about positive or negative feedback. If you give people positive or negative personality feedback, you don't get changes in sense of control. It's only if you give them positive or negative SES feedback. And this one was based on the scale. And here I'm showing that it's specific to traits that are about power, dominance, assuredness, not just any trait about the self, not just warmth, agreeableness. And importantly, in line with this mediating model, I think, oh yeah, you can see sense of control here seems to be mediating the link between subjective financial situation and number of cigarettes per day. This is a longitudinal mediation model where each one's measured at each time point, but we can't do a full cross lie because we don't have them at all measures. But importantly, it's not mediated by subjective strain. So it's not that the worse your financial situation, the more stressed you're feeling, and that's why you're smoking, or at least in terms of how people talk about strain. It's just a single item measure. We may not be being fair to it. But it seems to be to the extent that you're subjectively financially stressed and you're reporting not being able to control your environment, then there's this kind of, it doesn't make a difference. Maybe it's actually rational to focus on the present, and there are present important current rewards to be gained from the stress relief and the social conviviality of smoking, even if it comes at a long-term health cost. Obviously, I'm not going to talk through this, but Ivan's trying to disentangle what's going on with self-efficacy and response efficacy in terms of socioeconomic shame and the role of perception of your role in society with that. Okay, so yeah, this is how I try to keep tabs of how these things might be coming together. And I wouldn't call this a theory necessarily, kind of a model or an approach. You can see there's various things in there. Cognitive specialization, I think there's tuning to different rewards. And that was what was going on with the task where I said, if you perform well in this task, it's related to later life SES. But then there may be tuning to particular stimuli. That was the food study. And then there may be tuning to specific executive functions. This is what I was talking about earlier in other work by Frankenhuis and Young, where they're looking at different executive functions being honed in different early life environments. So the various different ways that we can think about cognitive performance that go beyond this kind of deficit model, and that also, I think, unlock the potential for better cognitive performance in those environments. And same with self-regulation. I'm exploring whether a construal level theory is a helpful framework to think about this kind of a narrowing of focus on multiple dimensions, that not just the temporal dimension, also the social dimension, also focusing on what's here, the spatial dimension, and even the existential one. Okay, so that's that for that run through in terms of, the mindsets. They are affected by these socio-ecological constraints in ways that might not always be damaging. Is this a problem? Do we then need to, maybe we need to intervene on the constraints to increase the mindsets? Yeah, yes and no. I mean, one paper I've been quite influenced by in reading around this area, and separately the political psychology side of me, is work by Glenn Adams and Sarah Stradivalalta, looking at what are the kind of self-ways that are particularly individualistic, particularly Western, that we are trying to push on people living in poverty and people living in non-Western contexts. And one way of thinking about these self-ways is in terms of market thinking, a particular self-way that's not just Western, but that's particularly honed for advanced free market capitalism. I feel I need to talk about this, being from the LSE, where we cultivated some of the best neoliberal thinkers, from Popper to Hayek. But in particular, you'll see in social theory, not in the psychology department, but you'll see over in anthropology and in gender studies and cultural studies, a lot of talk around how the market metaphor and market thinking has pervaded from the economic and political sphere into people's subjectivity or way of being, right? Foucault in particular made this point about neoliberal governmentality. Now, I remember when I was at Harvard, and I used to like reading some of these postmodern, post-structuralist thinkers, and everyone made fun of me, and now I kind of get why, because you can just say whatever you want. But then, if you don't empirically test it. But then I got emboldened by reading Glenn Adams's paper, where he actually started trying to articulate what are the specific components of what a neoliberal subjectivity would be. If we take Foucault seriously on this point, right, that the idea that there's a particular subject that needs to be cultivated in order to lead to kind of productivity and atomized consumerism on the market, it would involve the self being entrepreneurial, always focused on changing skills to meet a changing market. It would focus on having a personal growth imperative, one always needs to improve, one is never good enough. Managing affect, always needing to be positive. Radical abstraction from context, it's just about me. One thing they didn't mention, but that I get from other work, is that in the social realm, one would need to think about market relations and not to think about other kinds of relations. So Jamil Zaki made this point about market cognition, and it was wonderful to see relational models theory come up earlier, so I'm going to bring that back up again. So what I'm doing now with work that I started before with Sabrina Paiwand, who's now a first-year PhD student with me, and also Denise Barron, who graduated a year ago, is that we're trying to see, well, okay, what happens if you do measure this then? Is it the case that people do endorse these kinds of self-weighs? And if so, what does that predict? So we have developed a measure called a marketized self scale. This is scale validation, self-optimization. I try to maximize productivity by watching how I manage my time. Self-enhancement is another dimension. I want to keep reinventing myself to stay on top of market trends. I try to spend more time thinking about positive things than negative things. And then investing in friends is like investing in anything. You need to think about whether the cost is worth the benefit. So kind of willing mobilization of market discourse and application of it to many aspects of your life. And of course, self accountability. It's my duty and my duty alone to make the right choices in my life. I hope we can see the broad mapping here. I mean, we arrived at these based on the theoretical framework, and it's only after that I'm kind of like, oh, actually, this kind of sounds like those mindsets gone into overdrive. And what happens when they go into overdrive? Well, the more you endorse the marketized self at one time point, the higher you are in perfectionism a year and a half later. This is studies over sampling Generation Z because we're trying to look at issues that we think are particularly heightened in this generation, and also the higher levels of social media addiction you have over time. This is over 18 months, I think, in a cross-like model. But for current purposes, surely this should help those low in SES, right? This should still be motivating for those low in SES, and I think perhaps so. And I think there are definitely some positive aspects. But I just want to highlight some of the things to reflect on. If you are low in SES, the more you endorse this marketized self, the greater shame you feel for being low in SES. And if you are low in social class, the lower you are identified with your social class, the more you endorse the marketized self. Right? So it's like this disidentification with group and collective thinking, and more it's all about me, and I've got to make it, and I've got to make it, and I'm ashamed of myself if I don't make it. Okay, so with that in mind, can we think about, where does this leave us, and can we think about what other ways there are of being, right? So if market pricing is just one way of thinking about social relations, and the marketized self is just one way of thinking about the self, can we think about interventions that don't just come with material support, but that also come with allowing a different self-way, or allowing a different form of the relational self? So here, this is just first off, just some work from Ivan showing that, it is the case that like social welfare schemes might be able to buffer the impact of income on perceived control. So in countries that have more strong social welfare schemes to those low in income, the gradient between income and sense of control is less steep. Another study that we did was we actually, it's really hard to do things cross-nationally like this. There's a lot of stuff going on cross-nationally. You can't control for everything. And also these policies are the result of past dependent processes. So what we did here is then we tried to take advantage of two new policies, the furlough scheme in the UK, and this is the energy price guarantee in the UK. We wanted to see whether making people aware of the energy price guarantee would change their response efficacy, but in turn, as a function of taking advantage of something that was happening at the particular moment we launched the study, which was that it was really unclear how this was going to be implemented in Northern Ireland, but it was very clear how it was going to be implemented in England. And so we pre-registered this three-way interaction between socioeconomic status, the salience of the prime, and the country of origin, and that's exactly what we found. I'm just showing you the low-income group here. We're in England, where it's clear that the policy, how it will be implemented, and this policy was about guaranteeing that nobody would have to pay more than £2,000 a month for their energy bills in the middle of the cost of living crisis. People's response efficacy goes up when they're primed of the policy. Right. So to think beyond the relational models, so here you can see drawing on Fisk 1991, I'm a big fan of relational models theory, and I'm glad that this has already been introduced. Communal sharing, already mentioned, I'm gonna take advantage of that. There are other relational models that Fisk talked about, fundamental relational templates born out of the kind of applied to interpersonal relations. Authority ranking, communal sharing is the idea that everybody gets what they need. Authority ranking is relevant to resource distribution in terms of sometimes some people should get more than others. Equality matching is the idea that everyone should get the same amount. And market pricing, as already introduced earlier, is about proportionality, right? It's about you should get according to precisely what you gave. Now, in some theoretical work with Lunda Thompson, what we're doing is we're trying to say, okay, well, these are for the interpersonal context. What happens when we try to figure out how we should distribute resources between groups in society? Because large-scale societies are not what we evolved for. And yet we have to use that kind of primitive, basic relational templates to figure out what kind of ways we should support people in society. So we're positing a model for where ideological individual differences can be understood in terms of individual differences in the preferred application of and implementation of different relational templates from the interpersonal to the intergroup context. That's that's a political psychology point. But with Julia and Jens Madsen, my colleague at the LSE, we're looking at, okay, so then, given that, what happens if you take people experiencing scarcity and you give them an option to get social support, social welfare support, from a welfare scheme that is based on different relational models. Okay, so it's an example of thinking about, I have other work looking at whether ideology actually does map onto, and whether we can see in experimental games individual differences in preference for application of these models translate into differences in contributions to public goods societies that are run along these principles. But here, we kind of design an insurance scheme that's run along these different principles, except authority ranking. And then we see, so to what extent does that affect decision making? So I'm going to walk you through this. On my timing, I've got 10 minutes. That's, what do you, you're going to say 5? Okay, we're still between 40 and 45. Okay, let's see what happens. This is a study we just got the data in for on Wednesday, and a big thank you to Julia for analyzing the data in time. But I really love it, so I wanted to be able to talk about it today. So it's a multiplayer experimental game where people are introduced to this world, Orcadia, and you can see Dali helped us out world. And they're going to each month they're going to go through a series of rounds in this world. Okay. So first they're introduced to Orcadia, Rolling Hills, and they're corn farmers. So it's a corn farming game. The first thing that you need to do is everybody's going to contribute 20% of points to a shared insurance pot. Okay, this is actually based on a public goods game, but we're not measuring contributions. We're imposing a tax for contributions. And this is going to be seeds that are going to be kept in a seed bank. They're going to be, because those corn plants are going to be cultivated in a greenhouse, so they're going to grow faster, so they're going to be able to be multiplied, just as the common pool in a public goods game would be multiplied. Then we give them a temporal discounting decision, right? Okay, now you're going to get a chance to plant some corn plants. Do you want to plant short corn, which will give you 20 plants right now, or tall corn, which takes longer to grow but will produce 40 later on? Okay. Now, if you choose the now one, obviously you get fewer plants, but you can use those plants in the game right now. If you choose the later ones, you only get them at the very end. Then we introduce a shock. Okay, stormy season has arrived. So people play 2 rounds of this game, then stormy season arrives. You have a 25% probability through the storm of experiencing a shock of between 10 and 30 points, which would take away 10 to 30 of your plants. And if you're shocked, the good news is if you're shocked, you'll be liable, qualified for an insurance payout according to where that insurance payout is paid out according to different relational models. Okay, so how does that work? Well, there's 4 different conditions of the game. One is communal sharing, which is effectively a very progressive form of social insurance. What happens is that among those farmers who are shocked, you get more paid out the more in danger you are of falling below a critical threshold. So there is a threshold penalty that you can incur, which is where all your plants get eroded. Not all of them, many of your plants get eroded if you go below a certain level of 80 plants. Okay, that's what I mean by threshold. So in communal sharing, the further below the threshold you are, the greater support you get. The further above the threshold you are, the less support you get. It's progressive, based on giving more to those in need. In equality matching, you just get, if you get a shock, then you get your insurance payout, which is going to be a quarter of what everybody contributed that round times the multiplier. Okay, a market pricing one, it depends what you contributed before, right? In fact, it's going to be a direct function of how much did you contribute before. Now, of course, everyone contributes 20%, but everyone's endowments are changing over time, right? So wealthier people are effectively contributing more, and that means that they're getting more in the payout in this condition. And then we just had a personal insurance condition, which is where you just give the money yourself, it gets multiplied, and then you get it back. There's no shared pool or pot in that version. Okay, so then I mentioned the threshold penalty. People are aware of how close they are to this erosion threshold. And then you do another round and you make the choice, you make the payment, you make the choice, you go through. So we only had time to do 3 rounds of this game after the insurance is introduced. So the first thing we did for parameter setting was we ran an agent-based model on this to figure out effectively what are the optimal choices in these different conditions, in these different versions of things. And as you can see, in the communal sharing condition, it is more optimal to make later choices that benefit the future versus sooner, right? So the red line there, right, especially for ends 3, 4, 5, the red line there is lowest in the communal sharing condition. So this is, I think, around so this is around 1,300 agents running 400 times this computer simulation. In the equality matching and market pricing conditions, it's a little bit higher, so people will be a little bit more present biased. And in the personal insurance condition, you've got the greatest amount of sooner choice is optimal, right? We program all these agents to be optimal, and then we see how is it that they behave. So what happens in the actual game? We did this as an online multiplayer experimental game. So we've run it once, and I'm going to show you the replication study, which is a larger one, but the patterns are the same. First, as we go round by round, we take these measures. Some of them are about agency, interdependence. Some of them are about collective agency, which we're still struggling to try and measure, sense of identification, sense of solidarity. Here you can see that the communal sharing condition, the only thing it's higher on is, I feel, a sense of community with the other farmers in Arcadia. And I feel like the seed bank prioritizes protecting farmers in need. Interestingly, we're not seeing any effects on agency here. I won't have time to go through the other conditions, but importantly, you can use the information from the agent-based model to figure out what are the optimal choices. It's not always optimal to choose later, right? Sometimes it's optimal to choose the current option. And so then you can figure out how many choices are suboptimal versus optimal by condition. And that's where we find this pattern. And we can only look at rounds 3, 4, 5. That's all we have. But it was rounds 3, 4, 5 in the agent game, in the agent-based model that had these effects. Not exactly the same as the agent-based model, but the core finding, and the one we pre-registered, is that communal sharing was going to outperform on optimal choice, especially compared to market pricing condition, and we clearly find that. Here are the stats on it. Interestingly, you'll see personal insurance is doing a little bit better than market pricing. They're actually based on the same principles. Personal insurance is you get the payout according to how much you contributed, but it's just you putting it in a bank and you take it out. In the market pricing, when you put it in a common pool and you get the payout according to what you contributed, it's the same amount. And as we were just saying earlier, maybe there's something there about the social expectations of a social welfare scheme that then kind of get cheapened every time you're told you're getting a payout from the collective pool according to what you contributed. It feels like it almost violates, a social relationship in a way that isn't in the personal insurance condition. We didn't pre-register predictions around equality matching. You can see it's around the middle, but I'm not going to look too much into that. I think this is really exciting because the great thing about experimental games is that you can mess with society, right? You can change the institutional parameters. And I think that what we're trying to do is change the institutional parameters in a psychologically interesting way, in a way that speaks to present bias decision-making in the context of forms of social support that are specified and precise, and that tap into different versions of ourselves, right? Because the market pricing self, I think, is just one version of ourselves. Whereas the social self that's embedded in communal sharing relationships is another. And it's great that we kind of have converging evidence on that, especially with the talk earlier. Okay, so to finish, decision-making in poverty should be viewed as responsive to socio-ecological context. It seems material and social adversity seem to predict selective executive functioning, I would say, maybe reprioritize self-regulation, selective trust, lower perceived control, and positive affect. This could be the first 3 could be a kind of adaptive modulation. And the last 2, they're not necessarily good news, but I think they are maybe still adaptive to the extent that you're recalibrating your read of your environment and of how valued you are and how in control you are in ways that maybe we don't want to meddle with, to the extent that people are accurately perceiving how much power, for example, that they have. The mindsets that we prescribe are themselves ideologically embedded. They can go into overdrive in form of the marketized self, but somewhat hopefully perhaps interventions that go beyond the individual to engender stronger social solidarity might improve decision making. And what we're going to do when we pool the samples, which is also pre-registered, is that we're going to look at the group outcomes. And does this affect welfare of the group? Does this affect inequality of the group? And that's it. Thank you.
short Q&A.
Great, that was really interesting. I was wondering if you could say how your last experiment, who were the participants, and how did they score on the marketized self, and how do you think it would differ if you had different participants with maybe a lower score on marketized self?
So the marketized self research is kind of a parallel project. I just threw it in for fun because I know Catherine likes it. I thought she'd forgive me for it. It's the kind of thing you always want to present in front of economists. So we didn't measure that in that group, but it's prolific academic, UK-based people. I do have the demographics and stuff on a slide if you're, but I don't have scores on marketized self. I think we have like MacArthur, like financial strain, things like that. They're a typical prolific sample, which is quite socioeconomically diverse, but not representative one. Got an idea to score with that. Back up from here. Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Gautam Rao, faculty member here at Berkeley. So that was a masterful talk with lots of things, and I was kind of curious to hear. I really liked the final slide when I think you were asking us to. You were kind of reframing what we know about, say, scarcity or socioeconomic stress in terms of its effects on executive function and a bunch of other things. And was I right in seeing this overall as a somewhat more positive take than maybe we might have had 10 years ago? That it's not just to think that scarcity depletes cognitive bandwidth and scarcity makes you worse at many things, but rather is sort of changing what you're paying attention to. And if so, do you have speculative thoughts on what implications that has for how we think about how important financial stress and scarcity is for, say, decision making or the quality of decision making?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, yes, it does imply that I'm not the only one making that point. There's lots of really great research streams, and also the original scarcity research didn't also claim that there's a cognitive shutdown. There is recognition from the Nude Chat, for example, that there are some tasks on which those low income are stronger at. What I'm showing is the importance of the stimuli in the task and then the reward for the task. And when others have looked at in what's called the hidden talents framework, have focused on scarcity and unpredictability experienced when young, and they're the ones who focus on the different kinds of executive functioning. But yeah, I'm a fan of Kurzban and L's opportunity cost model, which is this idea that what might look like depleted cognitive capacity is actually your cognitive resources just shifting to something that seems to be more adaptive in the current context. And what policy implications are there of that? Well, I mean, to the extent that academic tasks can be made to be more relevant either to the threats that people are facing or to the kind of decisions that people need to make in their everyday lives in low-income contexts, I think there's some hope there. And we do know, for example, that ecologically valid cognitive measures can enable stronger performance among those low income. I think Ethan Young is doing some work on that too. I've tried to look at it in terms of abstract versus concrete and whether tasks that take advantage of concrete information processing might see better performance. We haven't yet found that, but I haven't looked at executive functioning for a while, so I need to kind of go back to that work. I'd be interested in others' ideas. I think it's just something we got to figure out. Long way from figuring out.
So I love that you're at the very end of the conclusion, you just casually mentioned adaptation and recalibration. That's just really enlightening for this space, I think. But my question is about communal sharing. And I'm wondering, I know there are a lot of people in this room have thought about like kinship taxes, for instance, and how it could benefit you as an individual to take from the pool, but then won't you be expected to pay out again and have redistributed pressures. So I guess have you thought about the other side of that, speaking but giving, and how that relates to just what naturally occurs in the context of greater interdependence, economic interdependence?
No, but I think it's great. I mean, there is some evidence for that, right? Of also decreased like productivity. I'm even thinking of the work that Julia was doing with you and the cashew nut workers in Cote d'Ivoire, of like reduced productivity the more enmeshed you are in redistributed networks. So I think we absolutely, we don't want to fall into this romanticization of community and disjoint agency and interdependence, and because it comes with responsibility, not just the ability to gain. But I mean, I think multiplayer experimental games can easily enable you to explore that, at least in a mechanistic way, to figure out with conceptual precision what's going on before we then go out into the messy world. You'll notice that all of the data I presented was like, lab, online, none of this was field studies, and but I'm kind of focused on that mechanistic precision and then figure out what, so I think that would be a great place to start, would be to see how that plays out in a game like this.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Paul. I work for the Sea Change Initiative at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I'm curious about two things. One, maximizing productivity and what that has on mindsets. I'm kind of curious if maximizing any one thing has maladaptive effects on mindsets, and what you think about psychological flexibility as something that might increase resilience in unreliable or uncertain times.
Yeah, I mean, it depends whether you mean that in a fluffy sense of psychological flexibility versus the more precise cognitive flexibility measure. But I think both of them are of interest, because the cognitive flexibility measure, I think what I was harking to earlier was evidence that if you grow up in an unpredictable environment, you might be better at cognitive flexibility when that environment is reminded to you, and that implies that that's because you're in an unstable environment, so you keep needing to be able to shift and to see the rules change. Whereas what you don't need is to have good inhibitory control, because why would you have inhibitory? Why would you be holding off when the environment keeps changing? But I think that almost implies that there has been some pressure that happened when young, that such that for some people, inhibitory control is actually more important than cognitive flexibility, to the extent that you can't always predict what your ecology is going to be like, and your parents make sure that it's always predictable, then maybe it is okay to trade off that. So I'm not sure flexibility will always be good as that small cognitive skill. On the bigger scale, I think psychological flexibility is really going to matter for especially things like cultural mismatch in institutions, which someone mentioned earlier, because it's not going to be enough to just leave behind, like, let's say, working class ways of interacting and thinking about academics to just like become middle class in a university setting. One needs to, because that will lead to alienation and cut off. One needs to be able to shift between the two. I was going to make another point about flexibility. No, I can't remember my third point in that. Oh yeah, it was just related to I think that the exciting work is looking at, I'm just thinking about the fMRI study that we saw earlier, and it's one thing to see about high-low SES, but if we can actually see how people are responding to changes in reward schedules, like using this kind of reinforcement learning approach, then you can actually see how the extent to which people are reading cues. I think that's it seems to be pretty clear that being able to notice a change in reward schedule and environment is a good thing. And if we can both use that to figure out what kind of skills do people have, but also to figure out how can we understand how these skills developed in the first place, by kind of mimicking that early childhood environment through these kind of experimental games. It's just something I think is cool. Probably it.
Stop it there for Jennifer's.